So the way this afternoon is going to work, we're going to roll through some of AEMS's legislative priorities that have to do with arts education in the general session statewide. We'll spend a little bit of time at the end talking about national priorities and then have some time for Q&A. So again, my name is Rachel McGrain. I'm Executive Director here at AEMS, and here we go. So what I'm sharing on my screen is on the AEMS website. Patrick's going to drop a link in the chat to the page where you can find this on our website. So I'm going to start with some of our AEMS specific priorities for the legislative session. And if you're not super familiar, legislative session in Maryland is 90 days, started at the beginning of January and goes through April. And this is when all of the laws for the state are created for the year. So AEMS is the host of the Maryland Arts Education Data Project, which is a publicly accessible set of dashboards that shows access and enrollment data for what arts education courses students have access to in all Maryland public schools. Currently, it's populated with 5 years of data from 2018-19 all the way to 22-23, and we're about to get a 6th year uploaded. This is very brand new, even though we've been working on it for a long time. So it just launched in April after several years of piloting and switching around platforms. And so we really want to give it a shot to be the useful tool that we think it can be to help advocates and communities, and to help with greater transparency and decision making. So we're looking for state funding for that, which is where the initial funding came from. So we're hoping to continue that. We're also working in collaboration with our sister organization, Arts Every Day in Baltimore City, to renew funding for the Maggie McIntosh School Arts Fund. So this is a Baltimore City specific initiative, but theoretically in the future with potential to be expanded. And so we're looking at renewing funding for this project that funds major art space renovations. So far, we've been able to do that in 8 schools in the city. 3 of them are complete and the rest are in progress. I actually had the chance to go to a ribbon cutting ceremony at North Bend Elementary School just last week, which was very exciting. And so we're also working on that as one of our priorities. And finally, so you may be familiar with the Blueprint for Maryland's Future, big education law that's been passed a few years ago. Implementation is underway. Hot topic for education folks. There is specific language in the Blueprint that ties per pupil funding to the arts. And it's labeled as COMAR, the Code of Maryland Annotated Regulations for Fine Arts, says per pupil funding can be used to support that. And concentration and poverty funds can also be used to support arts programming as wraparound services. However, that language as it currently stands in the Blueprint sunsets in FY27 and fiscal 27. And so we are working to get that sunset language taken out so that the Blueprint can support the arts in perpetuity. It's not limited to a specific year. So it's not looking like that's going to happen this year, but we are continuing to have it in our priorities for this year so that we can be in a good position to pursue that for next year. Still within the education realm, but a little bit larger, AEMS is a member of a few different coalitions, education-wide coalitions, including the Blueprint Coalition and the Maryland Education Coalition. So there are a host of priorities amongst those 2 coalitions, and you can read more about them here, but what I'm going to focus on is kind of this overarching goal for adequate and full funding so that we can really implement the Blueprint and all education priorities with fidelity. So I'm actually going to switch over to another document that Patrick's also going to share the link in the chat for. This doc has a whole bunch of links on it, including the ones that we just looked at. And I'm going to pull out a few bills in particular that we as part of our coalitions are looking at. So the first one is the Excellence in Maryland Public Schools Act. This bill was actually proposed by the governor and the leadership in the Senate and the House. And as members of those coalitions, are opposing this bill. The very, very big picture of this is that it is seeking to pause the implementation of extended collaborative time for teachers in schools and pause community schools funding. So what this would actually do like right now would decrease funding required both from state and locals for per pupil funding and for concentration of poverty grants. And both of those buckets support the arts. So we want to make sure that the blueprint is completely funded. It's funded with fidelity. We don't want any major alterations like this one would provide. And so that's why we are coming out in opposition to that. So if you're interested in this one, you can check out Strong Schools Maryland has an action alert. There will be hearings on this bill next week in 3 different committees, and there's some template testimony, again, from Strong Schools. AEMS's testimony will be coming soon, and you can learn a little bit more if you want to dive into the numbers. There's a spreadsheet here and some commentary in Maryland Matters. So there's lots of different ways to get involved. For pretty much all of these, there's like, if you have 2 minutes, do the action alert. If you have 5 minutes, do the action alert and send it to somebody. If you have a little bit more time, consider doing written testimony, or you can sign on to AEMS's testimony. And if you have a lot of time and are able to come to Annapolis to help pack the rooms for those hearings, of course, that's always welcome, though we know that can be very difficult for folks who are teaching during the day. And that's part of the reason why we're here, to make sure that, that the arts community is represented. So kind of in that same vein of full funding, we are supporting, again, as AEMS and as part of our coalitions, the Fair Share for Maryland Act. So there are elements of this that are in the governor's current proposed budget, but there are still more room to grow based on what's on this act. Again, the big highlights of this are that it would increase taxes on the wealthiest 1% of Marylanders and close some corporate loopholes, all with the goal of increasing revenue for the state, so that instead of always having to figure out where can we cut things, and as we know, oftentimes that comes down to the arts and the local level, we want to make sure that there's more revenue to support all of the important priorities. So again, there's an action alert from the Fair Share Coalition. Testimony is in February and at the beginning of March. Templates for testimony coming soon, and there's more info at Fair Share Maryland. The next big piece in the General Assembly that we're looking at is the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act of 2025, also known as the BRFA. There is a lot in here, and there's 2 things in particular I want to highlight. One, the Blueprint Coalition is supporting this with amendment to make sure that the funding laid out in there is aligned with MSDE Aid to Education, and that's kind of like the big bucket where all the money from the state comes and comes down to LEAs. But then also as part of the larger arts community, Maryland Citizens for the Arts is leading the charge on this, opposing a piece of the BRFA, which is the elimination of the Arts Stabilization Act. So this act has been around for 30 years. It's really important. It basically says that the funding level for the Maryland State Arts Council cannot be decreased from year to year. So it provides stability. The governor has put in the FY26 budget an increase for the State Arts Council. However, eliminating the Arts Stabilization Act could put that in jeopardy for future years, and would also make it a lot more difficult for the many people who are impacted by the Arts Council's funding to plan effectively for that. And that includes grant programs like Arts and Education. So it's all interconnected there. You can learn more and take action through Maryland Citizens for the Arts here. Through this link. Testimony and hearings in the House and Senate are going to be the 25th and 26th. We have an AEMS letter opposing the elimination of the Arts Stabilization Act that you can take a look at, and we will be working on kind of combining these pieces, again, coming soon. The final piece on the state level that I want to mention is the Protecting Sensitive Locations Act. This recently dropped. We have already heard through our arts community that the executive orders and administrative transition is having a negative impact on students in our arts communities. So there are a lot of out of school time activities happening, whether that be auditions, rehearsals, performances, things like that. And there are students who are at risk now participating in those activities outside of school because of what's going on with immigration enforcement. And so these bills seek to strengthen protections around schools to make schools safer for all of our students, and particularly those from immigrant families. So there's a little bit more information here. And for all of these, this is all moving very fast. So we'll be updating things as we get more information from all of our coalition partners. And the folks who we are most closely in touch with on this is CASA in Maryland. I did say that was it for state, but I'm going to do two more quick, share two more things and go back to the AEMS legislative page. So our friends at the Maryland State Education Association have some legislative priorities as well that we're well aligned with, and they have some action alerts. You can learn more there. And then we're also supporting our friends at the elementary and secondary school principal associations. They are working to try and get an acting principal on the State Board of Education. We know that principals can have an outsized impact on the success of arts learning in schools. The really great principals who are champions of the arts can foster a really wonderful environment, and the reverse can be true as well. And so we want to make sure that whatever the policies are coming out from the state are really informed by what's going on the ground. And we're very lucky right now to have a music teacher as a member of the State Board of Education, which has been really helpful, that general perspective of having an active teacher on the board. So kind of same principle here with having a principal on the board. The last chunk of information I'm going to share before we get to our Q&A is a little bit of the national landscape. So as you all know, this is changing rapidly. I just 2 hours ago got a little bit more information and added some more links here. So things are changing quickly, and there's still a lot of unknown. A few big picture pieces, the title program. So for example, Title I, money going to schools with high concentrations of poverty, IDEA, supporting students with disabilities. As of right now, those are funded through the end of the school year. However, there's a possibility that that could change in the future. And there is a possibility, and there's been talk about this, and a bill has been introduced to eliminate the U.S. Department of Education. So again, there's a lot of unknown there. I would encourage and invite you, if you're not already connected with the National Education Association, to connect with them. They have a number of resources and action alerts. Tomorrow is Linda McMahon's appointment as Secretary of Education hearing. So there's some action alerts around that. And the NEA is also trying to collect stories of, if you have already been impacted by the executive orders, they want to know about it. How is that impacting your classroom? So there's a link to contribute to that here. Additional resources, the NEA has some resources on supporting LGBTQ+ students, and AEMS is actually hosting through our Maryland Center for Creative Classrooms a course on supporting LGBTQ+ students and families. That'll be happening virtually in March. It's free, so there's a registration link there. And then the NEA also has some resources on supporting immigrant families and students, and some more community resources from the Immigrant Defense Project on that same topic. Just a couple more resources to share. The Ed Council, this was one that I got just today. This is really deep and in the weeds, but if you're interested, they put together a summary and analysis of the executive actions impacting education. And then specifically on the arts education front, the Arts Education Alliance is an alliance of 5 organizations, so the national organizations for music, dance, theater, art, and media arts. So they've banded together. You can learn more generally about their alliance and their work here, but also they have a specific action alert to support federal funding that impacts arts education. So going back to those title funds, this is an action alert about that, and speaking out to protect those title funds. And then finally, the other NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts, is also going through some changes. So as of right now, they still have funding, but there are new guidelines requiring compliance with executive orders for applicants. And their equity work has been closed out. You can't access that on their website anymore. So again, as of now, that agency does have funding and is continuing some, but not all of its grant programs, and some of the requirements have changed. So that was a lot of information. I'm going to stop my screen share. again, thank you all for being here, for listening. We have all of these links and share with you all, for you to share with folks. And I'm gonna open up the floor for some questions and conversation at this time.
So going back to the Maryland specific stuff, I have to dig through this, but I appreciate it in one spot. Can you just give me like a quick, the thing that you are maybe most concerned about moving forward that's happening at the state level with legislation, and how you think, like, what the top thing you think, or if it's two things, that's fine.
That's a good question. So I think I would say, and Patrick, feel free to interject if you have different thoughts. I would say the Excellence in Maryland Public Schools Act. So that's the first one on the list. And in particular, because that is one that does have a lot of power behind it, because it's coming from the governor and from leadership. But it's been really interesting being kind of in the advocacy circles and hearing everyone's reactions in real time to like press releases and things that are coming out. That the way the governor is coming out and sharing that information is essentially, we don't have enough teachers for collaborative time anyways. This really isn't going to have a big impact. But when you really dive deep into the impacts, it is going to have an impact. It has a real dollar amount impact on our per pupil funding, which we know impacts the arts. So I think that's a really big and important one on the education front. And then on the arts front, the Arts Stabilization Act, like it doesn't, to me, it just doesn't quite make sense why you would get rid of that, especially if you are, the administration is saying they've committed to funding the arts and not cutting it back. So there's really no reason to roll back that Stabilization Act. So I would say those are the top two.
I do have a small interjection about the Excellence Education Act. The blueprint is already funded fully for the next 2 years. So even if the bill gets passed and does all of the changes that it plans to for the budget, it won't change anything for the math for the budget for the next 2 entire fiscal years. So it really doesn't actually close the gap right now, and doesn't really do what the governor says it's going to.
Right, thanks for that question. Any other questions or comments or additions, or if there's anything also that anyone in this room knows that wasn't shared that you think might be important for fellow arts educators and arts ed advocates to know, definitely welcome that as well.
So what was just said, is the blueprint funded for 2 more years, or can it be overturned?
So there's a special, and again, Patrick, please correct me if I'm misrepresenting anything. So there's a special blueprint trust fund that is set up specifically to fund the blueprint through fiscal 27. So that money is there, it's set aside, it can't go to the general operating budget. So even if less money is spent on the blueprint this year, that's not going to help the general operating deficit for the state. Come fiscal 28, that's when the two are going to kind of merge. So the longer that there can be funds sort of stretched out from the trust fund, then looking in future years, that could help with the general operating budget. But not at the current moment.
But wasn't the initial plan that legalizing gambling would be making this money? Wasn't that where it came from initially?
That sounds right to me. And I think that is still the case, but I think the issue is that the costs for the blueprint are going to continue to increase as we're ramping up implementation. So at some point, that's not going to be enough to make up the gap, and then the gap would start dipping into the general fund. It's all very complicated, and this year in particular is, I think, the most complex that we've seen in a while in terms of all of the funding streams and where everything is going and all of that. I'll share one more piece. I know this in of itself was a lot of information. There is yet even more. So if this didn't feel overwhelming to you and you want to dive even deeper, there's a host of other bills that are a little bit more specific and in the weeds that we're involved with through our coalitions. So happy to follow up with more information about some of those outside of the main highlights. Okay.